Well, it's that time of the year again where conspiracy theorists gather for Bilderberg, and guess what? It's Bilderberg 2013. It's fastly becoming a sort of Woodstock type, hippie festival where all these people gather once a year somewhere in Europe and have a big old protest about nothing. So as I said in the past, Bilderberg dates back to post-World War II, where Europe was not in a very good relationship-wise with the US. Now, I believe it was the King of Sweden at the time realised that if Europe isn't going to be friendly with the US, it's more going to be friendly with the USSR. Now, he didn't want that, so what did he do? He set up an organisation, the Bilderberg Group, which promotes European relations with the US. That's all it is. Now, this year, guess what? We've got an early agenda leaked. Because apparently, and as you'll tell you later, they have contacts on the inside. So, let's get into this, shall we?
Good evening, InfoWars viewers.
First thing I want you to notice here is, at any point during this video, they claim they have this agenda. Now, that's the only time you will ever see the agenda on view. And quite frankly, that doesn't look like an agenda at all. To me, that's just a wall of text. It doesn't look like agenda at all. There is no marks on it to signify that it's real or anything like that. So quite frankly, as far as I'm concerned, they're making it up, and we'll go into that later on.
It's May the 10th. I'm here with Paul Joseph Watson, and we're at the Grove Hotel in Watford, which is in England, and this is the scene for the Bilderberg conference coming up on the 8th of June, just about a month away. Paul, good evening.
Evening, good to be here. Yeah, we basically arrived about 3 hours ago. We've had a walk around the grounds inside the hotel. Basically been everywhere. It's a huge, sprawling hotel. The grounds are massive. They're going to have a police operation in force, which is taxpayer funded. And
yes, of course it is, because, as I've said, this is an event where European politicians as well as American politicians will come. Of course, there's going to be a security operation. And of course, the best option is to have the police actually do it, not get a private firm in, which would cost even more.
And actually, an article out of the Watford Observer that came out today relates how the mayor of Watford is complaining about how the protesters at Bilderberg are potentially going to be violent, even though there's been no violence whatsoever at Bilderberg protests.
Now, it's bear in mind, when you read that article, the mayor is basically worried that there might be violence. Now, it's true, there hasn't been violence in the past. However, that is always a concern where these types of protests do occasionally turn violent. There are numerous examples of where protests have basically turned violent. So, of course, that the mayor is worried.
Since they started gaining traction several years ago. The police have said they'll facilitate peaceful protests. The problem being, as we've shown you in other YouTube videos, there's basically no access for car parking or areas which people can congregate to protest.
Bear in mind, this hotel is basically pretty much in the countryside, basically. So, of course, there isn't going to be access at all, and yet they're complaining, oh, how dare they not have access for us. They're just crybabies at this moment in time being.
Only thin little strips of land. It's going to be very difficult to get anywhere near the hotel. There's a security exercise around the whole hotel. So it's not going to be as easy as it was in Switzerland when we were camped out right across the road from the hotel, and of course the grounds were not as extensive. Here at the Grove they are massive. But now we're going to go through the agenda, what they're likely to talk about at Bilderberg 2013 from our inside sources. Of course, the late great Jim Tucker was key in identifying this location as the site of the 2013 Bilderberg conference, and his sources live on through other people, and we've got people on the inside as well that give us indications, at least early indications, about what Bilderberg will be discussing.
And that's a load of bullshit. Let me tell you why. Sooner or later, when a journalist gets a source, what they will do is this. They will cultivate the source. They will get as much information as they can from the source, and then eventually there comes a time where they have to reveal their source. Because why? It gives them credibility. It doesn't matter you've got all these documents, or you could have basically made them up. So sooner or later, you have to reveal your source. No point in this entire protest, Jim Tucker and these guys included, they have never ever once revealed their source. Now, as we're going to go into the things that are saying, everything here is current. There is nothing that will give you a surprise. Everything at the moment is current events, yet these guys will constantly complain that these guys are predicting events, they are controlling the supposed events that are going to happen. Yet, if that's the case, why then are they talking about, current events? Why then is there only one meeting a year? Surely if this is so important type of thing, there would be at least more than one meeting. Oh yeah, and by the way, it wasn't that hard because, by the way, Bilderberg advertise where their next meeting is going to be on their website. So, yeah, thumbs up for secrecy there, Paul. And yet again, as I've said, everything here you're going to see is current. There is nothing new, there is nothing surprising, and we're going to go through this now, and you'll see how much ridiculousness this actually is.
So we're going to go through it briefly now. In reverse order, they're going to talk about the threat caused to social stability by declining living standards and wealth. So we've seen in Europe over the past several years riots. That's going to continue because the economy is going to continue to falter. There's going to be no recovery in 2013. It's going to stagnate. So they're worried about riots. Of course,
no, they're worried about living conditions and declining wealth. So that doesn't automatically equal riots, unfortunately, Paul. That's just a completely ridiculous comparison. Riots just start. It's very hard to pinpoint why they often start, or even really what the cause was. For example, the London riots a couple of years ago, you can't exactly pinpoint, what was the cause of that riot. So, to say that they are worried about people's living conditions, particularly for lower people, is quite a humanitarian effort. So, to say, again, as you'll come on to see, that these people, want to control people, yet they are quite worried about, the lowest of the low, quite the contradiction to what these people often say.
We've got DHS in America preparing for riots right now. They're going to talk about advancing so-called smart cities to spy on every aspect of public behaviour, which of course we've seen in America with IntelliStreets. Those are the light poles that record your conversations.
Yeah, and again, that story, if you look it up, the light is completely... it's made up, basically. Smart cities, what they really want to do with these is it's like having a smart house. It's the exact same concept. They want things to be more wireless in the terms of how, for example, lights are switched on within the city. They want it to be more wireless. So that means they have to lay less cabling within cities. Means that there's less roadworks, less interference within the city itself, which it's basically a huge improvement for that particular city. So they haven't said a thing about spying on anyone. So again, this is completely made up.
Of course, we've seen the 10-10 plan and the technocracy, the cry freedom ghettos that they plan to install under the guise of smart cities, which in reality are surveillance technocracies. So they very much plan to advance that agenda at Bilderberg 2013. They're also talking about cyber resilience, which in their eyes, they sell it as cyber security. Of course, we know all the cyber attacks have actually been launched by the United States and Israel, the main ones, such as Flames, Stuxnet, etc. So
not the case, unfortunately. Many of the cyber attacks are just done by random groups. They are not affiliated with governments. And as you go on, this apparently even builds into more. So he's not entirely telling the truth of what this apparently agenda item supposedly is.
They're going to push it under the guise of cyber security, but it's actually internet censorship once again. They call it digital wildfires, so they want to...
Yeah, let's explain the concept. As everyone knows who uses the internet now, information spreads very, very fast over the internet. And this can either be good or bad PR. So, basically, telling, politicians, hey, look, this is the internet, this is what happens when, this type of thing happens, it makes sense. So, and they're not doing any censorship at all, so I don't understand why someone coming along and telling, this is, this is how the internet works, essentially, is a bad thing.
Put out the digital wildfires, and how are they going to do that? By creating what Bill Clinton called for several years ago, a Ministry of Truth for the Internet, and that's basically...
Yeah, let me go on to that, because that basically hurts Watson. What does he actually want to do? Well, as you know, the internet is a massive sharing pot of information now. Not everything on the internet is true. And what Bill Clinton wanted to do was he wanted to set up a database of scientific, educational, basically established knowledge of everything that was true and factual and could be proven to be true would go on this database. So that if you were looking out for something on the internet, you could go to this website, look it up, and know with 100% clarity that it was true and factual information. Now this causes huge concerns to people like Watson here, who basically make stuff up, lie, and basically sell you the wrong information so that you'll get, you'll buy into what they're selling, basically. And they are selling products to you, whether you realise it or not.
Either a UN or a government-controlled body that vets and verifies every piece of information put out on the internet before allowing it to be published. Of course, that sounds like a complete...
Not every single piece of information. Like I said, it's only established knowledge that they know to be true and factual.
Censorship, draconian nightmare, and it will be eagerly resisted, but that's what they're moving towards under this digital wildfires idea. They can't bear the spread of information on the free internet.
What they're also worried about is people spreading wrongful information like you, Watson, so that's why you're worried about it.
They're also going to be talking about the manufacturing revolution of 3D printing, which of course we saw in the news yesterday, the shutdown of Defence Distributed, the manufacturer of the 3D gun.
Yeah, let's go into that. 3D printing is a very big revolution because, as I've heard, I forget which film it was, but, plastics are the future. Having, these printers print out, complicated designs and things like that is a huge boost in manufacturing. Here's the thing, though. These 3D printers, if you want one, you're talking about £30,000. If you want to go cheaper, the cheapest you can get is one for £10,000. So that's essentially what you're looking at. But there are cheaper 3D printers available out there, but they're not as good as the full the ones like that I've just mentioned. In fact, the cheapest one, when I was looking around, you're talking at least £5,000 to £6,000 for one you can use in your home. And of course, why are they worried about it? Because they don't want people... Why was that place shut down? It's obvious why it was shut down, because they don't want people printing guns that they cannot track, they cannot prove, that are untraceable. Can you imagine a second someone printing out a 3D gun? Because first of all, it's untraceable. It can get through metal detectors because there's no metal parts in it. So it's a disaster waiting to happen, and I'm, in the future you will see more stuff like this pulled because it is incredibly dangerous. But other than that, they are talking about the actual revolution that 3D printing is actually bringing to the manufacturing world. And again, Watson's going, how dare they stop people printing guns in their own home? Because that's not the world's brightest idea, is it?
US government has now basically shut them down completely, and indications are that Bilderberg will discuss the revolution of 3D printing and ways to control it and prevent the democratization of production, because it's another thing they're very concerned about.
No, they're not. If they were, why are there, as I've said, commercial home 3D printers available now? That's just stupid, and it's again another fact that these people claim that these people are in the power and they control everything. That's just really to show you they are really not. They are not at all.
Having that kind of technology in the hands of the general public makes them more free, makes them more prosperous. So they want to control it. They want to.
Unless you're a business, really, and your business is 3D printing. I don't understand how that would affect someone whose business is not 3D printing.
Regulate it via copyright and other means. So they're going to be talking about 3D printing, according to this inside source.
The inside source that you basically made up. By this point, it should be very clear that these guys are making this up fully. There is no inside source. There is no, deep throat for them, so to say. And if you look very carefully at the other people who have supposedly got their inside sources, this is their agenda is vastly different to what Watson is saying. And by the way, watch these people closely, because throughout the rest of this year, stuff is just going to basically appear on this agenda, out of nowhere. And they're going to claim, oh yeah, they talked about it, but that wasn't on the agenda last time you talked about it, so they're making it up.
They're also going to be talking about the threat of a global pandemic caused in part by rising resistance to antibiotics, which of course, given the behaviour of some of the pharmaceutical companies like Baxter, who release bird flu virus and other viruses into the general public with little...
No, they didn't actually release it. That's basically, you're implying that they did that willingly. No, they didn't. It was actually an accident. They've even said it's an accident. There's even a report into the fact that even states how it happened and how basically that it was an accident, and it didn't even get out into the public. It happened in a lab. So that's again a straight up lie. But again, talking about pandemics, of course, that's always going to be an issue. Governments are prepared for any potential pandemic that could happen, and the fact that viruses and things like that are evolving, which is what viruses do, because they're a virus. That's how they act. Again, if Watson had any natural proper knowledge of any medical fields, he would know viruses evolve, as do our products. We are going through at the moment probably the first time in our history where viruses are starting to outpace our drugs. So we're having to now develop new drugs so that we can keep ahead of the virus. So again, Watson basically talking out of his ass and basically making shit up. Well, making it up, basically, full stop.
Concern whatsoever, then the finger of suspicion very much falls on the pharmaceutical industry itself, which is routinely represented at Bilderberg.
He claims, routinely represented, yet, as Bilderberg have said, it's only open for politicians and people who are to do with governments in the West and in Europe. So how does a pharmaceutical company get invited to what is essentially a political get-together and to foster relations between Europe and the US?
So they're worried about a global pandemic when the pharmaceutical industry has in the past been behind those pandemic threats by releasing accidentally the bird flu virus, as in the case of Baxter.
Yeah, they didn't. I've just said why.
Geopolitically, they're going to be talking about arming the Syrian rebels, of course, in...
The Syrian rebels, Watson's favourite subject. Now, we'll let him get through this because this is just hilarious, and it's a very telling of what he's been doing for the past couple of years since this whole situation has arisen.
Switzerland in 2011, they talked about finishing the job in Libya. 3 months later, it happened. They armed the rebels. The rebels went into Tripoli, killed Gaddafi.
Let me talk about that. That was already on the cards before Bilderberg was even talking about it. That had been the discussion since the beginning of the conflict. Should countries get involved and help arm the rebels and take them down? So that wasn't even really a talking point. That was already on the tables of many of the Europeans that were already talking about it anyway. So
they got the job done for the globalists. That, of course, led to the Benghazi incident and that whole blowback because they were arming and funding Al-Qaeda terrorists.
No, they weren't. Essentially, what they were doing was they were funding the rebels. What happened was that within these rebels, there were genuine terrorists who managed to get hold of the weapons and then do the attack. So they weren't funding them with knowledge that they were terrorists or that this was going to happen. So, again, Watson generally making stuff up, and is about to say something really, really pisses me off.
As they are now in Syria. So basically they're going to talk about arming the Syrian rebels, carving up the country, and toppling President Bashar al-Assad. That's going to be very much on the agenda in the 3 months after it's discussed at Bilderberg. Also, Iran...
Yeah, right. Basically, if you didn't hear that, Watson basically said that all the Syrian rebels are terrorists. They are not people who have been living under basically an oppressive dictatorship, who daily lives were far worse than Watson, and don't have the freedoms that Watson basically has on a daily basis. He's a massive hypocrite, because Watson should be supporting the Syrian rebels because they're trying to fight to change their government, to help change their way of life, to help get them more freedom. Again, there was no freedom of the press in Syria, and he's talking about carving up Syria. No one's talked about that at all. No one's even said that. No one's discussed that at all. So, again, Watson pulling something completely out of his ass. Again, I've said this before. People like Watson and Jones and all the conspiracy theorists, they should be supporting the Syrian rebels because they are trying to overthrow a dictator. And yet, apparently, they are not in favour because, oh, look, these terrorists. Oof. You know, it was the same last year in Libya. They were calling the Libyan, rebels. They were calling them terrorists because they were trying to overthrow Gaddafi, who was a dictator. He was throwing his opposition in jail. If Watson was in Libya and he was a Libyan and he said anything like this, Gaddafi would have thrown him in jail and no one would have ever seen him again. He would have probably been tortured and maybe even starved to death. So, why isn't Watson on the side of the Syrian rebels? It's an absolute mystery. Now, I'm not saying that, he's paid, informant or anything like that. No, because, again, that him being paid informant is just absolutely ridiculous beyond words. Again, as I've said multiple times, people who do these big conspiracy theories, they're only in it for the money. And, people don't understand, people like Jones and David Icke and even Watson himself take home huge salaries. They are living quite comfortably, basically making up lies and selling it to you. And you're being duped, basically, by these people.
Of course, the path to Persia goes through Syria. Kissinger is eagerly pushing an Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, and he basically wants that within a 3-year window. So expect more pressure to be heaped on Iran. As
I said, well, I've said this before, but in a video, but Iran's nuclear program is not to develop weapons; it's to develop power. If they were going to develop nuclear weapons, that would be an entirely different program. So I've never heard this quote from Henry Kissinger. So as far as I'm concerned, Watson's probably making this up. So.
And they're going to discuss again attacking Iran's nuclear facilities, getting it done within the next 3 years. That's going to be on the agenda.
What is it? 2013. So apparently, if by 2016 this hasn't happened, I'm calling Watson an absolute liar on this, as he basically is.
Agenda. With regard to the economy, we're talking about...
Yeah, politicians meeting and talking about the economy, that's not a surprise at all.
About increased inflation, even runaway inflation in Europe. We're talking about more aggressive powers of tax collection.
No one's talked about that at all.
We're talking about increased power gathered by central banks.
No one's mentioned anything about that at all. So again, Watson trying to basically scaremonger and fearmonger you there.
Under the excuse of bank reform.
Yeah, giving banks more power is not bank reform.
Talking about things like this, which of course happened in Cyprus, which was the outright theft. 40% from people's bank accounts who earned over 100.
Yeah, and he's been taken to court for that, by the way.
€1,000. That has now been announced as the template for the entire EU.
No, it hasn't. Banking systems around in Europe are vastly dependent on what the rules and regulations are within that particular country. And I'm sorry, no government in their right mind would just allow banks to basically steal money from their patrons and then put it into their own back pockets. Sorry, that is a complete lie, and Watson's trying to scare monkey now. I can't believe he's trying to get away with saying that.
So I expect them to talk about that. More bailouts to prop up the euro. Slovenia is going to be the next country to be bailed out. Again, minimal growth in 2013, stagnant economy. And then...
Not according to the reports.
With regard to the EU, of course, British Prime Minister David Cameron has promised a referendum on Britain leaving the EU if he's re-elected. They're not going to allow that if they can, because of course Bilderberg were behind the creation of the euro single currency. They were talking about it as far...
No, they weren't. They weren't behind it at all. That was basically the countries coming together and deciding that they wanted a single currency. Why? Because a single currency has huge economic advantages, believe it or not. Why is Britain not part of it? Because, well, we don't want to be part of it, ironically. And again, we get lots of stuff out of the EU, but it doesn't affect people like me or Watson. It only really affects big businesses that are basically trading within Europe. It basically gives us a heck of a lot more clout and allowed, rather than having to negotiate with separate countries. We can now negotiate basically with just the EU, which basically represents the whole of Europe, and we can basically negotiate with them rather than 7 different countries trying to get different prices. But again, you try telling this to people and people basically just don't understand the EU.
Back as 1955, and they...
an idea of a single currency has been around since the beginning of time, really since the Roman period, where Rome basically had one universal currency.
In fact, Etienne Davignon, Bilderberg steering committee member, bragged about it in 2009. He bragged that Bilderberg created the euro single currency, said it was the brainchild of the Bilderberg group. That was in the EU Observer. So this rise of UKIP in the United Kingdom, the backlash against the European Union, and the threat that Britain will...
Right, okay, UKIP's been on the rise for quite a number of years in the UK, and the ridiculous party, because they want to get out of the EU, which would be an absolute disaster for us. But that's another video. Why haven't Bilderberg, if you say Bilderberg, control everything that's going on in Europe, why haven't they stopped UKIP before? Why haven't they dealt with them beforehand? If that's the case, if Bilderberg are as powerful as people like Watson claim, why haven't they stopped them before?
Leave the EU is going to be very much on the agenda. And that is a summary of what we know they will talk about.
That's a summary of what you've just made up, because everything there is current affairs, and I could have made that list. That'd be that list would be so easy to make up. And again, this list will change throughout the year. Stuff will just happen upon it. Even when, you know, the event actually happens and the supposed full agenda comes out, note what's been said on here and what actually comes out on the official agenda. Again, they'll change it as and when they need to change it, and add stuff when they need to change it. Why? Because they're doing it basically as a... But first of all, basically as a fear-mongering tactic. Secondly, as a... to fool gullible idiots into following them, like John Scobie is behind the camera. So, as far as I'm concerned, Watson made this entire thing up. As far as I'm concerned, that laptop right there is probably what he typed it out on. So, let's discuss these ridiculous issues. If Watson wants to send me the actual document, you know, I can read it myself, then okay. If he wants to tell me his source, and I'll gladly talk to his source, we'll do sort of an off-camera conversation. If his source is, you know, listening, we'll do an off-camera conversation. You know, we'll sort of record it. I can edit your voice so it doesn't sound like you. You know, let's have a talk. Let's talk with a supposed inside Bilderberg source. You know, and I'm a skeptic of kind of these. I'm a debunker. If you want to, if people like Watson want to debunk me, all they have to do is let me talk to the source. Let me have a look at those documents you supposedly have, and you know, we'll talk.